Let's start by just going through a basic timeline and looking at all the ways in which different eras of Australia had very distinct periods of history. And it's really important to remember that whatever text you're studying, it's really linked to one of these periods. So if you already know what text you're looking at, you can come back and watch this video again in order to have a really solid understanding of the particular historical era which you need to know about. Let's begin. In about 68,000 BC is where the history of Australia really began. So, what happened at this time was the Aboriginal people first came to Australia. This makes them actually the oldest living culture in the world. Now, these people are often forgotten, and it's often assumed that Australia was discovered by the English later on. However, this is absolutely not true, and the really rich history of the Aboriginal people is definitely something which is going to be explored in your texts and which you really need to understand. Over 600 nations existed with a diverse language and cultural background. So it's really important to realise that it wasn't just one consistent culture across all of Australia, but instead that there are about 600 different subdivisions within the Aboriginal people. So every different tribe really had different customs, and it's really important to examine these individually and not to just generalise. The Aboriginal people were semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers. So basically what this means is they didn't have their houses in one place, but what they would do would be wandering around, building camps in different areas of the bush, gathering food and hunting as they went. So they really had a lifestyle which was very movement orientated, and they were always on the go. The Aboriginal people have a core belief in kinship and the dreaming. So this idea of the dreaming is basically the Aboriginal creation story. So like every religion has the different place where they were believed to come from, the Aboriginal people believe in the dream time where the earth was created. Land is considered to be spiritually alive, and all animals and a people are part of it. So the absolute core issue in Aboriginal culture is that the people really belong to the land, and that there's a deep relationship between the land and the people. Verbal history and paintings as expression and storytelling. So by this what I mean is the Aboriginal people didn't have books or anything like that where they wrote down their histories. Instead, everything was told orally, so mouth to mouth. The older Aboriginal would pass down the story to the younger Aboriginal, and then so on until the same ancient stories were passed down to the modern times. Therefore, basically, the Aboriginals have a cyclical belief in time and history. So time isn't particularly important to their culture due to the belief that history is always moving on and moving forward, but also moving backwards. So the Aboriginal people always have a relationship with their land, and particularly with their ancestors and elders. We then move on to the next very distinct period of Australian history. Now, as we've said, it can be really easy to think, oh yeah, this is where it all began. However, that is definitely not true. It didn't begin in 1788. However, this was the period when European settlement, and therefore sort of the modern settlement which we have today, came to Australia. So, in 1788, Captain James Cook set up a penal colony at Port Jackson, or as it's called today, Botany Bay. The basic idea of a penal colony is that all of England's overcrowding jails, all of those criminals were put on boats called convicts and then brought out to Australia to serve their jail sentences. So it's a little bit funny to think that Australian civilization as we know it was started out by a bunch of criminals. This means that the criminals were transported from London's crowded jails and brought out. This was a very difficult and long boat journey. So imagine being stuck on a crammed boat for absolutely months of your life. So you're exposed to things like illness and food shortages. So this was a very difficult period in these people's lives, and it was a very tough period in Australian history. We now move on to the next period. Now that was from 1800 to 1900, and that's where we really start seeing some changes in Australian history. The European settlements are here, and development is really starting to occur. So, for example, a New South Wales Parliament was set up. So today, obviously, we have our New South Wales State Parliament, all the states have their parliaments, and then we have the overall Australian government. This is where it all began, over 200 years ago. We also had a lot of free people beginning to immigrate to be miners and farmers in Australia. So no longer was Australia just a place for those criminals, but really people started coming out to Australia on their own and really liking what they saw. The beautiful land here provided opportunities for people to come out and start a new life. This was particularly emphasised by the gold rush of 1853. Now, when gold was discovered in Australia, it absolutely started a frenzy and a chaos. People from all over the world started coming to Australia, and that is really where multiculturalism began in Australia, because everyone loves gold, so people from all over the world were coming to get big chunks of this new gold which had been discovered in Australia. As we've said, this was the beginning of multiculturalism, but also the beginning of racism, because Australia, who'd so far been a predominantly white country, these new cultures were coming in and people didn't quite understand yet how to deal with cultures that were different from their own. So we had, for example, Chinese people coming, and also different cultures like Italian people, and the white people thinking that they didn't belong in this country. So again, this is an area which can definitely link to your area of study. Also at this time, Governor Burke declared that no one owned this land before British settlement. So this is an idea which is particularly linked to the Aboriginal culture, and also to texts in Year 12 which you might get, such as the rabbit-proof fence, which really deal with the concept that the Aboriginal people weren't people at all, and that they were really mistreated by the white settlers. This idea is called terra nullius. Now, terra nullius in Latin literally means a land that belonged to no one. The idea behind this is that when the white people came, they didn't see any houses or any fences or anything like that, and therefore they thought, no, this land doesn't belong to anyone, this is our land. We know now that this wasn't the case and that it belonged to the Aboriginal people. However, at the time, this was the all-pervasive idea. So as we've said, the idea that this land belonged to no one was entirely inaccurate. But at the time, it was considered to be true, and most people supported this idea. The Aboriginal population at this time was culled to about 1/4 of its size. So this is obviously absolutely tragic, and this was done through mass massacres, where literally hundreds or thousands of Aboriginal people were killed by white people at a time, and also through deliberately introducing diseases into the Aboriginal population, which their bodies weren't immune to. And this is also where Aboriginal struggles with alcoholism began, and this obviously led to a lot more deaths. It's a really tragic element of Australian history.